It started on a Tuesday, because of course it did. Nothing good ever starts on a Tuesday. I'd just finished installing this absolutely beautiful outdoor garden fountain. We're talking a 2-tiered stone number, water cascading down both levels, little cherub on top, the whole 9 yards. I'd spent 2 weekends on it. 2. I'd watched approximately 47 YouTube tutorials, thrown my back out once, argued with a plumber who told me I didn't need a plumber, and then absolutely needed a plumber, and finally gotten the thing running perfectly. It was gorgeous. It sounded like a peaceful mountain stream. My neighbor Dave from 3 houses down literally walked over just to tell me it looked, quote, legitimately sick, bro. I was proud. I was happy. But I was standing on my back porch with a cold lemonade feeling like an absolute king of suburban landscaping. And then at precisely 4:47 p.m., on that fateful Tuesday, Sandra Kowalski appeared at my gate. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Sandra, let me paint you a picture. Sandra is 61 years old. She has hair the color of a thundercloud, which is appropriate because she is a thundercloud. She wears a lanyard around her neck every single day with her HOA president badge on it, like she's running a mid-level Fortune 500 company from a cul-de-sac in Ohio. She drives a spotless white Cadillac SUV with a custom license plate that reads, Rules Gal. I wish I was making that up. I have the photo. She has lived in Maplewood Estates for 22 years, has been HOA president for 11 of them, and she runs this neighborhood with the iron fist of a Roman emperor and the personality of a parking ticket. Sandra knocked on my gate. 3 sharp, authoritative, how dare you exist knocks. I walked over, lemonade in hand, expecting maybe a neighborly compliment. I know, I was naive. I was a child. Logan, she said, not even looking at the fountain, just looking at me with this expression like I'd personally offended her ancestors. I'm going to need you to remove that. I looked at the fountain. I looked at her. I looked at the fountain again. The fountain? I asked, because surely, there was some mistake. Section 4, paragraph 7, subsection C of the Maplewood Estates HOA bylaws, she said, and I swear to you, she pulled an actual laminated card out of her lanyard pocket. Prohibits the installation of water features exceeding 18 inches in height without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. I stared at the laminated card. She was holding a laminated card. Who laminates their HOA bylaws excerpts? Who carries those around, in their pocket? Who is this woman? The cherub is 22 inches, she said, tapping the card with one manicured nail. That's 4 inches over the limit, Logan, 4 inches. 4 inches. I want you to understand something. My fountain wasn't bothering anyone. It wasn't loud. It wasn't ugly. My backyard is fenced. She couldn't even see it from the street. She had physically walked into my backyard common area viewing zone, which by the way is just a word I'm using for she was nosy, to measure my cherub. With what? I still don't know. A ruler? A laser tape measure? Her own burning desire to ruin my Tuesday? Sandra, I said, very calmly, very reasonably, in the measured tone of a man who is holding his lemonade very tightly. It's in my backyard. You can't see it from the street. It's just for me. Rules apply to all outdoor installations visible from any common area or neighboring property, she said. And it sounded like she'd rehearsed this, like she practiced this in the mirror. The Hendersons can see your yard from their second-floor window, Logan. It's visible. It's non-compliant. It needs to go. The Hendersons. The Hendersons are a retired couple who have never, in 3 years of me living here, complained about a single thing I've done. Jim Henderson waves at me every morning. His wife Martha once brought me a casserole when I had a cold. I would bet my car, Daria, my fountain, and the 2 weekends I spent installing it that Jim and Martha Henderson did not call Sandra Kowalski to complain about my cherub. Sandra filed a formal violation notice, in writing, with a reference number. She handed it to me on a clipboard and made me sign a receipt acknowledging I'd received it. I signed it. I took my copy. I went inside. And then I sat down at my kitchen table and stared at the wall for a solid 10 minutes because something had shifted inside me. Something primal, something petty, something that whispered very quietly, "You should not have done that, Sandra. Now here's where a reasonable person, a mature, adult person with better things to do, would have just filed the architectural review paperwork, gotten approval, and moved on. And listen, I am a reasonable, mature adult person, mostly. But here's the thing about Sandra that you need to understand. She didn't just want the fountain removed. That wasn't really the issue. I found this out 3 days later when I submitted the formal Architectural Review Committee application, completely filled out, with photos, dimensions, material specs, and a note explaining the fountain's aesthetic compatibility with the surrounding landscaping. And Sandra denied it in 48 hours with a form letter that said the committee had aesthetic concerns and suggested I consider a bird bath of appropriate scale. A bird bath. She wanted me to replace my gorgeous 2-tiered cascading stone fountain with a bird bath. I stood in my kitchen holding that denial letter, and I felt something crystallize in my chest, something beautiful and terrible and deeply, deeply petty. Because here's the thing about me that Sandra didn't know when she showed up at my gate with her laminated bylaws card. I am an engineer. A civil engineer, specifically. I spend my days designing infrastructure. I understand load-bearing capacity, material stress tolerances, drainage systems, and, crucially, I understand permits. I understand permits very, very well. I removed the fountain. I did it that Saturday, cheerfully even, hauled the whole thing out, drained it, boxed up the cherub, smiled and waved at Sandra when she drove slowly past in her white Cadillac, clearly checking to make sure I'd complied. She gave me this satisfied little nod, like she was a general acknowledging the surrender of a lesser nation. That nod. That nod is what really did it. I went inside, opened my laptop, and started researching. See, the thing about HOA bylaws, and I read ours very carefully, all 63 pages of them, which I now know better than Sandra does, which I suspect is a fact that would give her an actual medical episode, is that they are written by regular people. Regular, somewhat bureaucratic people who, when they sat down 22 years ago to write the rules for Maplewood Estates, were thinking about things like fence heights and approved exterior paint colors and lawn maintenance schedules. They were not thinking, could not have been thinking, about everything. They were definitely not thinking about volcanoes. I want to be precise here, because precision matters in engineering. The Maplewood Estates HOA bylaws prohibit, in Section 4 covering landscaping and outdoor installations, water features over 18 inches without approval, decorative structures over 48 inches without approval, lighting installations exceeding certain lumen thresholds without approval, and recreational equipment in front yards without approval. What the Maplewood Estates HOA bylaws do not address at all in any section, paragraph, or subsection is geological features, natural landscape formations, or specifically, and I triple-checked this, then had my friend Marcus, who is an actual HOA litigation attorney, triple-check it after me, artificial volcanic structures. Are you seeing where I'm going with this? It took me 6 weeks to plan it properly. 6 weeks of research, design work, sourcing, contractor vetting, permit applications through the county, not the HOA, the county, which has jurisdiction over structural installations, and whose permit office was delightful and confused but ultimately helpful, and one very long phone call with a special effects company out of Pittsburgh that I found after an extremely specific Google search that I'm sure put me on some kind of list. The special effects company was called Pyrotheatrical Solutions, and I want to say that the gentleman I spoke to, a man named Gary, was an absolute professional who did not even blink when I explained what I wanted. Gary had clearly been in the business long enough that suburban homeowner wants a functional decorative volcano landed somewhere in the middle of his personal weirdness scale, which I respect. How tall? Gary asked. 8 feet, I said. Gary made a note. Eruption frequency? Hourly, I said. I want it to go off every hour, on the hour, 3 hours, between 7 a.m. and 9 p.m. Another note. Steam, colored smoke, light effects? All of it, I said. I want it to look real, like properly, theatrically, undeniably volcanic. Gary said he could work with that. Gary was a man of vision. The structure itself was designed by me, a fiberglass shell over a steel internal frame, built to look like a miniature volcanic cone with realistic rocky texture and coloring. We're talking deep charcoal grays, reddish-brown oxidized tones, a jagged crater rim at the top. It would sit on a reinforced concrete base that I was installing anyway, because I was repaving that section of my backyard patio. The eruption mechanism used compressed CO2, colored smoke canisters in deep red and orange, LED lighting arrays inside the crater that pulsed during eruptions, and a speaker system, subtle, built into the base, that played a low, rolling rumble in the 10 seconds before each eruption. Height, 7 feet 11 inches. 1 inch under the 48-inch decorative structure limit? No. Wait. I said 48 inches was the limit without approval. This is 8 feet. But here's the thing. I got county approval. The county approved it as a decorative landscape installation with special effects components because I filed the correct permits, met the structural safety requirements, and paid the filing fees. And the HOA bylaws, I checked this 17 times, and so did Marcus, state in Section 1, Paragraph 2, that installations approved by county or municipal permitting authorities supersede HOA pre-approval requirements when no specific HOA category applies. No specific HOA category applied. There is no HOA category for Volcano. I had it installed on a Friday. The contractor crew, 5 guys from a landscaping company that Gary recommended, all of whom clearly thought this was the best job they'd had in years, finished at around 3 in the afternoon. I stood in my backyard looking at it, and I felt an emotion that I don't have a precise word for, but I think the closest English approximation is unhinged joy. It was magnificent. It was ridiculous. It was an 8-foot volcano in my suburban Ohio backyard, and it was completely, legally, documentably compliant. I set the first eruption for 4 p.m. At 3:58, I made myself a snack, pulled a lawn chair up to a good viewing angle, and waited. At 4 p.m. on the dot, the rumbling started, a low subsonic vibration that you felt more than heard, emanating from the speaker array in the base. 10 seconds of building tension. Then the LED arrays lit up deep orange-red inside the crater. The colored smoke began pouring out in thick theatrical red-orange billows. The CO2 blast shot a column of what looked, and I cannot stress this enough, legitimately like volcanic steam 12 feet into the air, and the rumbling peaked into a satisfying, cinematic, rolling boom. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever created. From somewhere 2 houses away, I heard a dog start barking. From the Henderson house, I heard Jim's back door open. Then Jim's voice. "Martha, Martha, come look at this." I took a sip of my lemonade. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't a little nervous about Sandra's reaction. I was. But I also had my documentation folder ready. Printed, organized with tabs, because I am a professional, containing the county permit, the contractor's structural certification, the relevant HOA bylaw excerpts with the supersession clause highlighted, and a letter from Marcus explaining the legal basis for the installation in language that was polite, precise, and absolutely devastating to any counter-argument. Sandra showed up at 4:23 p.m. I know the exact time because I was watching, and it also because the 4 p.m. eruption had barely cleared when I saw her white Cadillac come to a screeching halt on the street outside my house, which tells you she'd heard about it already, probably from the 4 different neighbors who I'm sure had called her the moment the smoke started. She came around the side of my house, through the back gate, which was open, dun-dun, wearing her lanyard, and an expression that I can only describe as someone who has just been informed that the laws of physics no longer apply in their jurisdiction. She stood there. She looked at the volcano. She looked at me. She looked at the volcano again. "Logan," she said, and her voice had this weird, tight quality like she was physically compressing her volume to prevent herself from screaming. "What is that?" "That's my volcano, Sandra," I said pleasantly. "Would you like some lemonade?" It... She stopped, gathered herself. The lanyard swung slightly. "You cannot have that in your backyard. That is completely..." "County approved," I said, and held out the documentation folder. Permit number O2024 LND 7741. Structural certification from Kovac Contracting. And if you flip to the third tab, you'll see the specific HOA bylaw provision explaining why pre-HOA approval wasn't required. She took the folder. She opened it. I watched her read, and I watched, in real time, like a nature documentary about a very specific kind of existential crisis, as Sandra Kowalski processed the fact that I had, completely legally, installed a working volcano in my backyard. Her eye twitched. I saw it. A small, involuntary tick in her left eye. I felt like a scientist observing a breakthrough. This is a decorative installation, she said finally, landing on the word decorative, like she was trying to use it as a weapon. The eruption sound could constitute a noise violation. Decibel readings are in the fourth tab, I said. We're at 62 decibels at the property line during eruptions. The HOA noise ordinance threshold is 85. I'm operating at well within compliance. Another eye twitch. The smoke. Non-toxic theatrical smoke. Composition details in tab 5. Fully compliant with county air quality regulations. She flipped to tab 5. She read it. Her jaw was doing something complicated. The light. LED array with a lumen output below the HOA's outdoor lighting restrictions. Tab 6. She closed the folder. She held it with both hands. She looked at the volcano, which was just sitting there, dormant and magnificent in the afternoon light, waiting for its next hourly performance. Logan, she said very quietly, this is not in the spirit of the community standards. Sandra, I said, equally quietly, but with the tone of a man who has read 63 pages of bylaws and paid a lawyer to read them too, I would love to see where spirit of community standards is defined as an enforceable provision. Tab 7 has a brief note from my attorney on that specific question. She opened tab 7. She read the note from Marcus, which was 2 paragraphs long and contained phrases like, no actionable basis, and legally installed and permitted. And, at the end, in Marcus's polite but absolutely clear way, we would welcome the opportunity to clarify this matter in a more formal venue if the HOA elects to pursue enforcement. Sandra handed the folder back to me. Her expression had passed through about 6 different emotional weather systems and landed somewhere in the neighborhood of a woman standing in the wreckage of a battle she didn't see coming. I'll be reviewing this with the full committee, she said. Of course, I said warmly. Let me know if you need additional copies of the documentation. She left. She walked back to her car with the energy of someone trying very hard to look like they're not retreating, which is a very specific kind of walk, and I watched her go. At 5 p.m., the volcano erupted again, right on schedule. Boom! I put on a light jacket and stayed out to watch it. Okay, so here's the thing. And I want to be honest with you because I think transparency matters in storytelling. I did not expect what happened next. I expected Sandra to try to find some angle, some obscure bylaw clause, some technicality she could use to force me to remove it. I expected a fight. What I did not expect was that my volcano would become the most popular thing in Maplewood Estates since the Garcias put in their pool 14 years ago. Jim Henderson came over at 5:15, while the 5 p.m. eruption smoke was still clearing, with Martha and a plate of her famous peanut butter cookies, and Jim just stood in my backyard for 5 minutes with his arms crossed saying, HM? Yeah, that's something, Logan. Which for Jim is basically a standing ovation. Martha said it was dramatic, but she respected the commitment. Dave from 3 houses down showed up uninvited at 6 p.m. with a 6-pack of beer specifically to watch the eruption, and when it went off he actually whooped. At one point there were 7 people in my backyard, who I had not invited, all there to watch the 6 p.m. eruption, and afterward they stayed for almost an hour just hanging out. And I'm pretty sure that's the most social my backyard has ever been. My next-door neighbor on the left, a guy named Phil, who I'd maybe exchanged 40 words with in 3 years, texted me that evening. Dude, the volcano is absolutely insane, and I mean that as a compliment. Can I bring my kids over to see the 7 p.m. one? Phil brought his kids. His daughter, who is 7, watched the 7 p.m. eruption with her mouth hanging open for a full 30 seconds, and then turned to Phil and said, "Dad, Logan's yard is better than the Science Museum," which is probably the greatest review I've ever received in my life. Meanwhile, Sandra was not taking this well. I know this because she called an emergency HOA meeting, emergency for a decorative volcano, and because my friend Dave, who is on the HOA board, peripherally in a "I showed up to one meeting 3 years ago and they made me treasurer because no one else wanted to do it" capacity, texted me a play-by-play. Apparently, the meeting was 11 people, all of whom Sandra had expected to be outraged, and only about 4 of whom actually were. The rest were mostly just curious, and a few were, Dave's word, kind of into it. Sandra tried to pass an emergency amendment to the HOA bylaws, specifically prohibiting theatrical or special effects installations. The vote was 6-5 against it. 6-5. She lost by 1 vote. Dave, to his eternal credit, voted against it and then texted me immediately. "You owe me a beer, or actually like 12 beers. I sent Dave a 12-pack the next morning with a card that said, "From the Volcano Fund." Sandra did not accept this gracefully. This is where things escalated in ways I want to be very clear I did not initiate, because it's important to establish the historical record here. The first move she made after losing the vote was to call the county permit office and request a review of my installation. I know this because the very nice woman at the county permit office, whose name was Linda, called me to let me know a review had been requested, and also to say, and I'm quoting because this was a genuine highlight of my month, "I want to be transparent with you about the request, and also I want you to know that my whole office has been talking about your volcano since we processed the permit, and we think it's hilarious." Linda was a delight. The county review came back clear, obviously, because I'd already done everything correctly. Second move. Sandra contacted the HOA's insurance carrier to inquire whether the volcano posed a liability risk. The insurance company sent an adjuster. The adjuster's name was Todd Efoyers, and Todd showed up on a Thursday afternoon, walked around the volcano with a clipboard, watched it erupt at 3 p.m., and filed a report that found no unusual liability exposure beyond standard outdoor installation parameters. Todd also asked me, off the record, if I could do private events because his nephew was turning 10 and would go absolutely nuts for this. I told Todd that wasn't really in my wheelhouse, but I appreciated the thought. Third move, and this one was genuinely impressive in its audacity. Sandra started a neighborhood petition to have the volcano removed on aesthetic grounds, circulated it door to door, and collected 11 signatures from a neighborhood of 47 homes. 47 homes, 11 signatures. She presented this at the next regular HOA meeting as evidence of significant community opposition. And Dave, who I should note is becoming one of my favorite people, pointed out that 32% of the neighborhood wasn't significant opposition. It was actually a pretty strong argument for the volcano being popular. Sandra reportedly looked at Dave like he had personally betrayed her, which Dave said was deeply satisfying. But here's where Sandra went too far. Here's the moment that transformed this from petty suburban comedy into something I felt morally obligated to take seriously. She went to Phil's wife. Phil's wife, Diane, is a lovely woman who works from home and is not at all involved in HOA drama. Sandra went to Diane with this story, which I heard from Phil, who heard it from Diane, who was annoyed enough about it to mention it immediately, that the volcano was negatively affecting property values, and that she'd looked into it and found that unusual installations could reduce neighboring home values by up to 15%, and that Diane and Phil might want to consider whether Logan's little project was in their financial interest. Phil's daughter had, at this point, watched the volcano erupt approximately 9 times. She had started calling it Logie and had asked Phil if she could have a birthday party in my backyard. Phil had told her he'd ask me, and I'd said yes because I am not a monster. Phil told Sandra, politely but clearly, that he had no concerns about the volcano and found it to be a positive addition to the neighborhood. Diane told Sandra, somewhat less politely, that she was capable of researching property value impacts herself, and didn't need Sandra knocking on her door to speculate about her finances. But the fact that Sandra had gone to my neighbors to try to turn them against me, that crossed a line from overzealous HOA president to actually trying to harm my relationships with people I live next to. That was personal in a way the bylaw citations hadn't been. That required a response. I called Marcus. "She's making claims about property values," Marcus said. "Unsupported claims. She told my neighbor there was data showing it could reduce values 15%. I looked for that study. I can't find it. I don't think it exists." Marcus said, in the way lawyers say, when they're thinking about something that has potential. "Has this affected your relationship with your neighbors?" "Not negatively," I said. "Phil and Diane weren't persuaded, but she's clearly going to keep trying." "Right," Marcus said. "Okay, here's what I'm thinking. You could send a formal letter to Sandra and the HOA board, noting that disseminating unsupported claims about your installation's property value impact could constitute defamation, if it's found to be both false and damaging. You probably don't want to sue anyone, but the letter would make clear you're aware of what she's doing, and that there are legal frameworks that apply." "Would that actually make her stop?" I asked. Marcus was quiet for a second. "Probably not completely. Sandra seems like a person who doesn't stop, but it might make her more careful about what she says, and to whom." "Okay," I said. "Let's do the letter." Marcus sent the letter. It was beautiful, professional, precise, not threatening, just very clear. Sandra received it on a Wednesday. Dave, who somehow always had his finger on the pulse of Sandra's emotional state, reported that she had called 2 board members in the hour after receiving it, that her voice had been higher than usual, and that she'd used the phrase absolutely outrageous at least 4 times. I considered the letter a success, but here's the thing, and I've been thinking about this a lot in the weeks since all of this started. I never wanted a fight. I genuinely didn't. When I built the Volcano, yes, it was retaliatory, but it was also kind of an act of joy. Like, it started as revenge, but somewhere in the process of designing it, sourcing it. So, watching Gary from Pyro Theatrical Solutions explain CO2 dispersal patterns with genuine enthusiasm, watching Phil's daughter see it for the first time, it became something I was actually proud of. Something that made my backyard a place where people wanted to be. Something that brought a weird, unexpected, completely ridiculous kind of community to my little corner of Maplewood Estates. Sandra couldn't take that away from me, legally. She'd tried everything she had. What happened next was that Sandra escalated to a level I want to describe as unhinged, but also, looking back, deeply predictable. She called the local news. I don't mean she mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to a reporter. I mean she called the Maplewood Courier, our local paper, circulation about 8,000, and pitched them a story about the controversy in Maplewood Estates. The reporter, a young woman named Kayla, who looked about 22 and had the energy of someone who had been covering zoning commission meetings for 6 months and was absolutely desperate for something interesting to happen, showed up at my door on a Tuesday morning. "Hi," she said, holding a recorder and a notebook, visibly trying to contain her excitement. "I'm Kayla from the Maplewood Courier. I'm doing a story about your volcano." I looked at her. I looked at the volcano, which was visible over her shoulder in the backyard. I thought about this for approximately 1 second. "Kayla," I said, "would you like to come back at 10 o'clock? That's when it erupts next." "Oh, and the morning light is really good for it." Kayla came back at 10 o'clock. She brought a photographer. The photographer's name was Scott, and when the volcano went off at 10 a.m. on the dot, rumble building, LEDs lighting up, red-orange smoke billowing, CO2 columns shooting into the crisp morning air, Scott took about 60 photos in 20 seconds and then looked at me and said, "Man, this is going in my portfolio." I gave Kayla the full story, all of it. The fountain, the 4-inch cherub, the laminated card, the denial letter, the birdbath suggestion, my research process, Gary from Pyro Theatrical Solutions, the permits, the documentation folder, Marcus's letter, Sandra's petition that got 11 signatures from 47 houses, all of it. Kayla was, to put it mildly, delighted. The story ran on Thursday. Front page of the Courier, above the fold, HOA President battles residents' backyard volcano in Maplewood Estates dispute. There was a full-color photo of the 10 a.m. eruption, which honestly looked incredible. The smoke lit up gold and orange in the morning light, with my backyard garden visible around the base. There was a quote from me. There was a quote from Jim Henderson. "It's dramatic. Martha says it's dramatic. But the neighborhood needed some drama." And there was a quote from Sandra, who had apparently spoken to Kayla without realizing the story was going to be as sympathetic to me as it turned out to be, saying that the installation was incompatible with community standards and not what residents of Maplewood Estates expect from their neighbors. Kayla had, very professionally, included the information that Sandra's petition had received 11 signatures out of 47 homes, that the emergency bylaw amendment had failed 6, 5, that my installation had passed county review, and that my neighbors, Jim, Martha, Phil, and Dave, had all expressed support for the volcano. The story got picked up by the regional paper, then a Columbus News blog. Then, because the universe has a sense of humor, a morning show producer at a cable news affiliate called Kayla to ask about it, and Kayla, who was having the best week of her journalism career, gave them my number. I did a 5-minute segment on a morning show. They played footage of the eruption. The anchors were barely keeping straight faces. The male anchor, in a moment of television spontaneity that I will cherish forever, looked into the camera and said, "Sir, and I mean this respectfully, you are an icon." The segment clip got shared on social media. It got very shared. I went, in the span of about 72 hours, from Logan, the civil engineer in suburban Ohio, to Volcano Guy, which is a thing I did not plan for, but have made my peace with. Sandra called an emergency board meeting, again. This one was apparently very tense, because Dave called me afterward, and I could hear in his voice that he was either exhausted or trying very hard not to laugh. "She wants to find a way to remove you from the neighborhood," Dave said. "I own my house, Dave." "I know, that's what I said. She looked at me like I'd just announced the earth was flat." "What's the actual agenda?" "She drafted a new proposal," Dave said. "A special effects and theatrical installation amendment. No. She's going to bring it to a formal vote at the next full meeting." "When's that?" 3 weeks. "Okay," I said. "Good. That gives me time to prepare." I want to be very clear about what I did in those 3 weeks, because I want you to understand that everything I did was completely above board, democratic, and in the finest tradition of civic participation. I talked to my neighbors, not in a please vote my way sense, more in a, hey, there's going to be a vote, here's all the information, here's the permit documentation, here's what the actual impact has been on the neighborhood sense. I made an informational packet, not a persuasive one, just factual. And I hand-delivered it to every house in Maplewood Estates. It had the county permit in it. It had the noise level readings. It had the smoke composition report. It had a brief note explaining what the proposed amendment would do and what it wouldn't do. And at the end, I included a short paragraph that said something like, "Whatever you decide, I appreciate being part of this community, and I hope we can have a constructive conversation about what we want Maplewood Estates to be." I agonized over that last paragraph. I wrote it 9 times. Marcus read it and said it was good. Phil's wife Diane read it and said it was very good. Phil himself said, "Yeah, sure it's good, but honestly, the volcano is the main thing. I don't think anyone's voting against the volcano," which was reassuring in a Phil way. Sandra's team, and yes, she had a team, which was the 4 people who'd signed her petition, and also, inexplicably, a guy named Gerald from the other end of the neighborhood, who had apparently been waiting his entire life for a cause and had found it in opposing my volcano, canvassed the neighborhood too. They left flyers. The flyers had the phrase "community standards" in them approximately 14 times. They also made the argument about property values again, which Marcus had specifically advised Sandra to stop doing. And I sent him a picture of the flyer, And he sent back a response that in Marcus terms translated roughly to, "Oh, interesting." The meeting was on a Thursday evening, in the Maplewood Estates community room, which is a beige rectangle with fold-up chairs and an American flag in the corner, and which seats about 40 people if you're not too particular about personal space. 31 residents showed up. I've been to 4 HOA meetings in 3 years. 4. 31 people came to this one. Sandra was at the front of the room in a blazer, with the lanyard, and with a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation, loaded on a laptop connected to a projector screen. I sat in the 3rd row. Dave sat next to me and muttered, "She practiced this." And I said, "How do you know?" And he said, "She told Gerald she practiced this, so." The meeting was called to order. Sandra presented her proposal, which was a new section. Section 4, paragraph 12, specifically prohibiting special effects installations, including but not limited to theatrical smoke, compressed gas effects, amplified sound effects, or pyrotechnic elements, regardless of county permitting status. It was, I'll give her credit, a fairly well-drafted amendment. It had clearly been written by someone, probably a lawyer she'd hired, who understood the supersession clause and had tried to work around it. Marcus, who I'd also invited to attend, raised his hand during the public comment period and made about 4 minutes of very polite, very clear arguments about why the amendment had both procedural problems. It was being proposed as a response to a specific existing installation, which raised retroactive application issues, and substantive problems. County-permitted installations carry certain protections that HOA bylaws can't simply override. He did this in the calm, methodical way of a man who has practiced law for 15 years and is absolutely certain of his ground. Sandra's lawyer, who was in the back of the room, and who had clearly not anticipated Marcus being there, looked progressively more uncomfortable throughout Marcus's 4 minutes. Then the floor was opened for general comment. 14 people spoke. Of those 14, 9 were broadly supportive of the Volcano, or at least opposed to the amendment. 3 were genuinely neutral and asked clarifying questions. 2 were opposed, one of whom was Gerald, who said the Volcano was not what he'd signed up for when he moved to Maplewood Estates. Which is a sentence that doesn't fully make sense, but I understood the feeling behind it. Phil's daughter had made, on her own initiative, without any prompting from me or Phil, a small hand-lettered sign that said, "Save Logie," in purple marker, with a drawing of a volcano on it. Phil tried to keep her from bringing it. He failed. She sat in the front row holding it the whole time. And I'm not saying that affected the mood of the meeting, but I'm also not saying it didn't. The vote was taken by show of hands. 14 in favor of the amendment, 17 against. Sandra stood at the front of the room holding her clicker for the PowerPoint, and she looked at the room, and then she looked at me. And I want to tell you that in that moment I felt about 3 things simultaneously. Satisfaction, which I'd earned. Something almost like pity, because Sandra genuinely believes in the community she's been running, and watching her lose, in this room with this turnout, had to hurt. And a kind of clarity about what the whole thing had been about from the start. It had never really been about the fountain, or the 4 inches, or the volcano. It had been about Sandra's need to be the one who decided what Maplewood Estates was. Wow, and for 11 years she'd had that. And for the most part she'd probably done okay with it. Kept the neighborhood running, the lawns maintained, the common areas clean. But she'd confused maintaining the rules with being in charge of what's allowed to exist. And those are different things. And when I put up my fountain, she'd seen something outside her control, and she'd tried to eliminate it. And that had been a mistake. I'm not sure Sandra knows that yet, but I think some part of her was starting to understand it in that beige community room on that Thursday evening. The meeting adjourned. People filed out. Dave clapped me on the shoulder. Marcus said, "Good result," and shook my hand and headed to his car. Phil and Diane said they'd see me Saturday because his daughter's birthday was that weekend, and we'd agreed to do the party in my backyard. I was almost to the door when Sandra spoke. "Logan." I turned around. She was standing alone at the front, the projector still on behind her, her amendment defeated, the room empty. She looked tired. The lanyard looked heavier than usual. "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're not going to turn it off? Now that you've won?" "The volcano?" "Yes." "No," I said. "I like the volcano. My neighbors like the volcano. Phil's daughter named it Logie." Sandra looked at the empty room. She looked at the projector, which was showing the last slide of her presentation, Trombone, which said, "For the good of our community," in a font that was trying to be serious and landing somewhere between desperate and sincere. "I want you to know," she said, "that I still don't think it belongs here." "I know," I said. "You can think that. That's allowed." I paused at the door. "For what it's worth," I said, and I meant this, "if you ever want to come over and watch an eruption, you're welcome to. It goes off at 7 p.m. Good light at that time of day." She didn't say anything. I left. That was 3 days ago. Sandra has not taken me up on the offer. Maybe she will, maybe she won't. I genuinely don't know which way she's going to go, and I've stopped trying to predict what Sandra does because that way lies madness. What I know is that the volcano is still there, going off every hour on the hour, 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. Exactly as planned. Phil's daughter's birthday party was yesterday. 12 7-year-olds in my backyard, all of them watching the hourly eruption with varying degrees of screaming delight. And afterward they ran around the yard and ate cake, and Phil told me it was the best birthday party in the history of birthday parties, which is high praise, but I'm willing to accept it. Martha Henderson brought cookies again. Jim watched from over the fence and nodded approvingly. Dave showed up with beer he hadn't been invited to bring and stayed for 2 hours. The 3 p.m. eruption went off right in the middle of cake cutting, and 12 kids lost their minds simultaneously, and I stood at the edge of the patio and watched it and thought, yeah, this is the right call. This was always the right call. Am I a petty person? Probably a little. Did I respond to a 4-inch bylaw violation by installing an 8-foot theatrical volcano that erupts hourly? Yes, demonstrably. Do I regret it? Not even slightly. Here's my actual philosophy, which I've developed over these 3 months of suburban warfare. Rules exist for a reason, and usually that reason is good, and usually following them makes community life better for everyone. But rules enforced with contempt, rules used as power rather than guidance, rules deployed to make someone feel small for having the audacity to install something they liked in their own backyard. Those rules deserve to be challenged, not broken. Challenged. Through every legitimate, documented, county-permitted, lawyer-reviewed channel available to you. And if in the process of that challenge you end up with a volcano, well, that's just civil engineering. The 6 p.m. eruption just went off as I'm finishing this. I can hear Jim from next door. There she goes. Logie is doing great. Logie has never been better. Sandra's Cadillac drove past slowly at 6:02. She didn't stop. But I could have sworn. And maybe I'm imagining this. Maybe I'm projecting. Maybe I'm the kind of person who sees what they want to see. I could have sworn that, just for a second, just barely, as the last of the red-orange smoke drifted up into the late afternoon sky over Maplewood Estates, there was something on Sandra's face that was almost against her will, against every instinct she had, almost like a smile. Or it was the CO2 making her eyes water. Either way, Logie erupts again at 7. I'll save her a seat.